One of the women I interviewed for this project told me that she was getting $3,000 a month in cash from the man that she was sugar dating. And one of her main concerns was what to do with that money, because it's this large sum of money, but it's also money that's obtained through stigmatized means.
Welcome to Pop Syllabus. I am your host, Christiana Mbakwe Medina. Now, since I came up with this show a few months back, this is an episode I wanted to make. I wanted to talk about women trying to secure a high value man. Some of that is very formal, right? We call it sugar dating, women who date men for money. And then some of that is aspirational. It's the sprinkle. It's women pursuing hypergamy, and they want a high value man and they hopefully want to marry that man. And I think we demonize those women, right? Because even though relationships at their core tend to be transactional, we have a big issue when people make them explicitly transactional. And today we're talking to Dr. Sawey, who's a professor at Cornell University, and her work goes into the world of sugar dating. She speaks to not just women who are sugaring, she speaks to the sugar daddies too. And we get into the politics of all of that. And I'm very curious about what you all think. Dr. Sawey, welcome to Pop Syllabus. I'm so excited to have you on the show. I love your work. I came across your research and I instantly was like to our producers, we have to have her on. You teach in the Department of Communications at Cornell, and your research focuses on media, gender, intimacy, and labor. And the reason I wanted to have you on is because I am obsessed with the online dating gurus, mostly women. There are some men who tell women that their job is to secure a high value man. And your research tends to coincide with that area of the internet. And I just want to know about how you got into that and how your own personal background informs the lens of your work. Because you talk about being a first generation college student, and I think you have a very compassionate perspective on women who want this lifestyle for themselves. So I'd love to hear about how you got into it and a bit more about yourself.
So it's, always a bit of a long, non-linear journey, right?
Yeah.
But I think largely it traces back to when I was in college, which was in the 2010s. I was at Temple University in Philly, and I started to see headlines about this website called Seeking Arrangement, and how Temple University, I forget which year it was, 2015 or 2016 or something like that, had the highest number of women college students sign up to use its services. So I was like, what is this? And saw a couple more articles about it, started reading. And then I figured out that it was this practice called sugar dating. Mm-hmm. And right around that same time, I didn't have cable when I was on campus, but when I would go home to visit my parents, they still had cable. So I would flip through the channels, see Lifetime Movie Network, and they often kind of without fail had some sort of movie on to the tune of Death by Sugar Daddy, that type of, I'm sure even just saying that you can kind of visualize what I'm talking about.
We know what happened. We know what happened.
Yes, the cash-strapped female college student who finds the charming older man who has this money and resources, and he is for a time able to provide for her until it goes by the wayside and she has to fear for her life. So I was starting to see these various media touch points. And then, my friends started dabbling with Seeking. No one ever actually went on a date with anyone, but we made a couple fake profiles.
Did you make a profile?
What that was all about. I was on the sidelines. I watched. I was, the dutiful student and researcher taking my field notes while they all explored this. So just kind of this ambient awareness of sugar dating is something that was going on in the world in a way that people were forming relationships. And it was right around that time as well that I met my eventual PhD advisor. So I appreciate that you mentioned my background as a first-gen college student. I had no idea what a PhD was.
Oh, wow.
Or what academic research was. And then I happened to take an advertising studies course. I was an advertising major, but this was a critical advertising studies course. So I took it with Professor Brooke Duffy, and we connected. She taught me about research, taught me about grad school, ended up getting a job at Cornell, where she is currently, and encouraging me to consider grad school and PhD studies. And I knew that I had this lingering interest in sugar dating, but then it also kind of spun out more broadly into what I had started to think of as at the time as the commodification of companionship.
Yeah.
So something that is happening in dating and romantic relationships, but then also something that is happening platonically. I encountered a website called rentafriend.com.
Wow.
I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this before.
No,
but people could...
no way. I don't want any more friends, let alone to rent one.
But what if you move to a new town and
I get it.
You want skydiving?
No judgment. Like, I think that commodification also happens in kind of marriages as well. Like, there is under capitalism, there's this very real material element to our most intimate relationships that you can either ignore, but we all know exist, right?
Yes, absolutely. And those are, kind of the sociologies of intimacy and economic exchange were things that became clearer to me as I got into PhD study. When I was doing my applications, I was just kind of like, this is wild. People are renting friends online. People are paying to go on dates or getting paid to go on dates. How can I grab onto this as a communication scholar and study it? So in my application, I just kind of put it out into the world as this seedling of an idea. Sugar dating is fascinating to me. These rental friendships are really fascinating. Even in other geographic contexts, phenomena like this are taking place. So I got into the PhD program, and then, once I figured out what a PhD was and learned how to do research, I started to discover, really enlightening work in sociology, in feminist media studies, even in science and technology studies that was helping me start to ask these questions about the ways that media represent practices like sugar dating, which is a nice callback to how I first got here, encountering those different media examples. And then also how people are using media, and specifically digital media, to participate in sugar dating. And then how the mounting regulations and governance that we have in the US, in other parts of the world, targeting online sexual expression, how all of these sorts of things are impacting the people who are interested in sugar relationships.
I'd love for us to get into that, because a word that comes up a lot is hypergamy, right? Hypergamy, which some people at home may not be familiar with this term, but a lot of fans of this podcast are very much into pop culture. So they are probably scrolling on TikTok and see people talking about hypergamy. I'd love for you to explain it to us in its current phenomenon and how it's existed over history, and why this is a thing that increasingly, I think a lot of not just young women, your research shows older women are pursuing, like hypergamy.
Yeah, so the TLDR with hypergamy would be dating up. So you tend to see the term hypergamy and then the phrase dating up kind of used interchangeably, and rightfully so, because historically hypergamy has referred to a practice of, forming a romantic relationship that permits you as a person to transcend some type of barrier. So this often comes up with class, and the earliest roots of the concept that I am at least familiar with in my research have to do with caste systems and with women's inability to purchase property on their own, to live in homes by themselves, all of these sorts of, as I said, barriers that stand in place, that having a romantic relationship, in this case specifically with a man who does have access to those material resources, helps you survive. Really.
It's just a way of transcending your current position, wherever you may be on the class or the economic ladder, right? Because something that fascinates me, there's something very relative about hypergamy. It's not going to mean the same thing to everyone. For instance, in an English concept, they would say that Catherine of Wales, now known as, Kate Middleton, she practiced hypergamy in the sense that even though economically her family had a lot of means, she married into the royal family, which from a class perspective was very different from, her background. Whereas hypergamy, maybe for some people, going from being someone working class to marrying a doctor, which is very different from being someone who's rich and marrying a future king, right?
Yeah, exactly. It could be a big leap,
Yeah.
As we're talking about a lot already between different class boundaries. It could be a smaller leap. It could also be a leap in, a difference in educational attainment and degrees. You having a high school degree, marrying someone who has a PhD.
Yeah.
That also can be a form of hypergamy.
And in your research, what is the version that most people are going for? Is it like straight up just like, I want someone with more money? Or are there like these nuances? Are the women into these nuances of it? Like, I have a high school diploma. I want somebody that has a master's, an MBA or a JD, for instance.
So it comes up a lot with class. And I will say that even within that, it's something that I think is important to highlight in the research that I've done. And one of the motivations behind the paper that I had published that you had the chance to read is these nuances, and that there is I would argue a popular framing of sugar dating and the type of hypergamy practice that happens within sugar dating that looks to those extremes, that, and in very gendered ways, which I'm sure we will continue to unpack in our conversation today, thinks of sugar dating as this avenue through which someone who is socioeconomically disadvantaged finds someone who is at the other end of the extreme, very advantaged.
Yeah.
There is a term that's used a lot in the sugar dating community, whale. I'm not sure if you've seen that.
I've come across it. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So like these top 1%ers, that's, I would say that is what a lot of people think of with sugar dating, but conversations that I had, pointed to some of those tendencies in sugar dating and a desire to meet those extremes, but then also some desire among folks to just have nicer, kind of maybe slightly more luxurious experiences than they could have on their own. So sugar dating might not be something that brings you millions of dollars, but it might be something that brings you a nice dinner on the weekend away from your kids, and you get a break, and you get this agreed upon opportunity to have time outside of your usual schedule. So again, there's like all of these different experiences are valid and they are happening. And it is why I like to point out and then push back on these popular framings, because they do tend to really hone in on those extremes.
I want to get into your study, which is called Mediating the Sugar Baby Imaginary, Popular Narratives About Gender and Sexuality in Sugar Dating. I'm going to cite you back to yourself right now. You say the results of this study are not meant to critique sex work or create distance between sugar dating and sex work. Rather, they exist to give sugar daters and non-sugar daters alike a more detailed understanding of how women experience this phenomenon. I want to talk about the distance that gets created between sugar dating and sex work, because it's hard to deny that there are like overlaps in some of these strategies, right? Because I find it so interesting that a lot of dating coaches and social media gurus will tell sugar babies, get super dressed up, go to a hotel bar, sit by yourself, and kind of look around and smile, which is an escorting technique, right? It's something that sex workers actually deploy. And there's a dating coach called Shara7 who I actually adore. I think she is like sprinkle. I think she's a genius. And she's always like, don't share your real vulnerabilities. Like, tell them a story. Like, don't tell a man your trauma, tell him a story, which is something that like some sex workers will do when, they have a client and they're just giving this man their fantasy. And I want to know, the women that you talk to who are sugar dating, do they situate themselves within the context of sex work, or do they see it as something very separate? And I'm curious about the ways they overlap.
It really varied. I had a number of people who felt like the two were one and the same. Mm-hmm. And in a few cases, for instance, I had an interview participant named Yvette who was actively participating in other types of sex work. So look to sugar dating as just one of the many access points that she had to sex work. But then I had other participants who felt like there was a meaningful distance between the two practices and had respect for sex work, but didn't think of themselves as sex workers. And there's a variety of reasons why people adopt the positionalities that they do, especially with something like sugar dating. And one of those could be a bit of self-preservation. We know that sex work is highly, highly stigmatized. And one of the things I've looked at in my research and that so many wonderful scholars have looked at in their research is how online sex work has really been kind of clamped down on and limited in light of legislation like FOSTA SESTA, which passed in 2018.
Backpage out the window. We're seeing there's an increasingly restriction on OnlyFans. Like there has been this concerted effort to ensure that online sex work is as regulated as possible and stigmatized, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and payment processors are like, no, not sex.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of incentives for platforms to not permit that type of work. So as I was saying, self-preservation, defining yourself in opposition to sex work allows you to potentially have access to websites and apps and even just experiences that might otherwise be limited. So
yeah, and marital prospects. There are men who will just, I know there's that famous case, right, about a man that sued his wife because he found out she was an escort or something like that. And he was like, you presented yourself as something else. I may be getting the nuances of the case wrong, but he was just like, you're an escort. I would have never married you if I knew you were an escort. And I think there's an element of, if you label yourself as a sex worker in the dating market, you cut off certain options.
Yeah. And it's a great example. People start to think of you differently as well. And I've had those conversations with a couple interview participants about encountering the same person on a, vanilla. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, vanilla dating apps. So that would
like
be
Tinder and those things.
Oh yeah. So we have vanilla, which would be apps and websites that weren't designed for sugar dating, Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, etc. And then we have the sugar and sugar adjacent side, which I would love to talk about more, at some point in our conversation, because the way that landscape has transformed itself in light of legislation and social change, et cetera, is fascinating. But I've talked to people who said that they will see someone on Tinder or Hinge, et cetera, and then see them on Seeking, and just the interactions that they have, the attention that they get can vary a lot. So there is stigma that's attached to it as well. Just, thinking about how you define yourself, how you want people to treat you. I think a lot of that can inform how you then go to define your role in the practice. And also just what people look to get out of sugar dating as well. I think that was one of the really meaningful takeaways from the interviews I've done, is that there are women, like I said, who think of it kind of work first. This is a form of labor for them. But then there are also women who think of sugar dating and their, again, the term vanilla, their vanilla dating practices is kind of one in the same. So why would it be work if that's also how I might, meet a husband one day?
I want to get into that because, you describe in your work that these women think of sugar dating as an entrepreneurial endeavor. And I'll just tell you a bit more about my cultural context that means I have a maybe more nuanced position on what is formally described as sugar dating. I'm Black, British, Nigerian, I'm Igbo, and my tribe, for better or worse, is kind of known, or not even just like Igbo women. I think Nigerian women are kind of dubbed as materialistic, right? Because there's this idea in our culture, for good or for bad, that if you're going to marry someone, he has to be able to take care of you. And so it's very clear terms, and dowries are still paid. Like my husband had to pay a bride price for me, which was just like at this point, it's like a symbolic formality. Like my dad wasn't selling me, because if he was, I'd be unaffordable. But it's just like, there's this idea that like if a man is going to come and again, property right, it's all very icky, right? But if a man is going to come and marry,
a willingness to do something.
Yes, you have to pay a price, right? And my late grandmother on my maternal side was very clear about how she wanted her daughters and her grandchildren to marry, and her expectation of what a man should and shouldn't be able to do for a woman, right? So I'm from a culture where it's just like, I wouldn't say sugar dating is all dating, but there is this expectation that not that a man has to pay to play, but if you're going to come around here, you have to be doing something. And which we know is like a sliding scale, and it can go into like, not even soft prostitution, it's just this like, for access, you can't get in here for free. And I'm curious about the women that are in like the gray area, where they may come from cultures like myself, where it's just like men are expected to be quote unquote providers. And then they're seeing this rhetoric online of like the sprinkle, but they don't necessarily think of themselves like the women of in your study who are very clear that like we're sugar dating as an entrepreneurial endeavor. I'm curious about like the gray area, because I think a lot of women in our culture right now of all ages kind of exist on it, where it's just like, if I'm going to go on a date, I want him to send me an Uber. I've heard women say that, like, I'm not going on a date unless I'm sent an Uber, which is a very like economic, clear transaction, but they would never see themselves as women who are sugar dating.
Yeah. You know, there's so much like, I'm looking for a man in finance.
Yeah.
And we have movies like The Materialists that just came out over the summer.
What's the song? I'm looking for a man in finance. 6'6", blue eyes, trust fund, whatever how it goes. the TikTok meme.
But yeah, these are discourses that are swirling around so much in the last year or so. And we can even bring trad wives into this larger conversation.
For sure.
As
I think we should, because if that's the apex of it, right? A trad wife is like a beautiful, blonde, thin woman who has secured the bag in such a way that she can be in her home and in domestic bliss.
Yes. And I think this is where I feel like there's a meaningful departure with sugar dating from something like trad wifery, or even honestly, some of the discourse with high value dating and with living a soft life, etc., is the extent to which marriage and domesticity are centered. And I think this is what starts to get sugar dating into trouble, is that, not everyone. There are people who will enter sugar dating and then, refer to themselves. There's a lot of meaning to the labels and the terminology that are used within this practice, which I think is another thing that kind of sets it apart from other kind of looser relationship ideologies, is that people will call themselves sugar babies or sugar daddies or sugar mamas, etc., and might form relationships and decide to transition to being, sugar boyfriends, sugar girlfriends, etc., and then ultimately get married. So it's not to say that marriage doesn't happen in sugar dating, but it seems like a lot of people enter sugar dating, not necessarily with the expectation that a relationship is going to result in marriage.
Yeah.
It is a relationship that is mutually beneficial, that is allowing both partners the opportunity to get what they want from it. So that might mean a woman is entering a sugar relationship and maintaining her own bank account and getting an allowance from someone, getting other resources from someone, keeping them for herself, like getting the bag, as we've been saying, but it's not necessarily in pursuit of a marriage that is going to, and specifically a very heteronormative marriage.
So this is a real business, because it's like, it really is entrepreneurial endeavor. Because if it's like, I don't want the outcome of a marriage, which if you get married, you technically may have access to less resources, paradoxically, right? Because you're not going to be getting a monthly allowance. It's just like, it becomes...
You've got the contract of the marriage.
You've got the contract. You're just in the home, right? So explain to me the reasons they see sugar dating as principally an entrepreneurial endeavor. And I'd love for you to explain more that, because I know there's the image of it's like young girl in her 20s, older man in their 60s, which is something I do see a lot that kind of makes me feel like, icky recession indicator. But you actually speak to women who are older, who are sugaring, which I found so radical and so interesting. So I'd love to get into that.
I'll start with that point, because that was also one of the most exciting outcomes of the research, was that I did have the opportunity to talk to people who broke that mold. Because I went into this dissertation assuming that it couldn't possibly be all, 20-year-olds who were dating 60-year-olds, like you just said. There had to be more nuance than that. And I was very fortunate to, and again, I will say that to the point about this being a stigmatized practice, people involved in it are, have long been marginalized and still deal with a lot of that. Recruitment was really challenging because of the way that sugar dating has been covered in media, those Lifetime Movie Network films I mentioned earlier, that's just one example. There's, rightfully so, a lot of reservations among people to discuss this openly. So I had some struggles with recruitment, but then was very fortunate to eventually speak with a number of people who, in a few cases were outside of that mold, were, 40-something divorcees with children who were coming into sugar dating, having already experienced various relationships, having gone through a marriage, having kids, etc. So it was nice to see that there were people who did meaningfully butt up against that, who were, middle-aged, and finding men who were also middle-aged, and there wasn't, as much of a distance between them as is often suggested in the coverage of sugar dating that we see, or even in some academic research. There is sometimes a tendency among scholars to define sugar dating as age gap dating, which might be true for a lot of people, but it's not true for everyone.
I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the age gap dating, the girls are just there because they have daddy issues and are in love. Like, the men aren't giving them money.
Yeah.
They're like, I love this old man. You're like, what? It's just like, he's not even rich. You're like, what? I see that on TikTok all the time. Like, I just fell for an older man, right? I won't even say they have daddy issues, but you see it. I've seen.
But no. Sometimes the world's real bleak. And someone is nice to you once.
But I see plenty of women who are much younger than their spouses, and these spouses are not that wealthy. It is love, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is that you mentioned the woman who's divorced and had children and had conventional relationships, and she's just like, I am not going to be around men unless I'm being paid to do it, and that is there's a bleakness to it, but then there's also like a real politic to it. It's just seeing the world as it is rather than she would like it to be. Is that I feel defeated, romantic relationship isn't for me? Or is it just like, I am seeing my time as money because we're in this stage of capitalism and you have children at home and you're like, well, if I'm going to have company, you might as well pay me to be there. I'm like curious about the motivations and the impulses to make a woman make that decision.
Yeah, that was the impression that I got from my research, was that a lot of it had to do with the ways that we value time. And I think this is meaningful because it fits into the broader, disillusionment with online dating that we all seem to be having these days, that the apps really friggin' suck and they're a time suck, and no one's actually, finding love or finding the right partner or whatever it is that they're looking for. So there is kind of an efficiency, that's desired, and wanting to make the most of the time that you have available and wanting that time to be spent as luxuriously, whatever you want luxury to mean to you, material or experiential or otherwise, making that as luxurious as possible. So that was the sense that I got from my conversations, was that there was this desire to make the most of your time and kind of cut out the bull.
Yeah.
And sugar dating helped with that.
Now, you say that these women see it as an entrepreneurial endeavor. I'm curious, like, how profitable is it really? Like, in terms of the women that secured a whale, what was their monthly allowance? Like, I'm always interested because in a way it's not a business. You're a contractor, because a business is the idea that it can generate income when you are not present and you're not working, right? You're extracting surplus value from other people's labor. So it's not a business in this conventional sense, but consultants are also contractors, right? So in the cruder sense, you are a contractor. And I'm interested, even though they saw it as businesses, were these businesses that were making them a lot of money or a little money, or was it just like all things under capitalism, you're kind of scraping by?
Yeah. So I guess maybe thinking of it more like a hustle than a business is helpful here. I didn't really speak to anyone who, looked to sugar dating as like, I'm like a sugar baby LLC. And
yeah. Well, I think it's because you use the word entrepreneurs. So they saw it like an entrepreneurial endeavor, but it's like entrepreneurial in the, I'm trying to hustle, get rich or die trying sense, more than the like, this is going to be a sugar dating conglomerate or whatever it is.
Yeah. And it panned out in a couple different ways. Again, like I said, to varying extremes. So I did talk to someone, and this was the most straightforward conversation about money that I had with a woman who sugar dated. I talked to a couple men about money, and we can definitely get to that at some point. But one of the women I interviewed for this project told me that she was getting $3,000 a month in cash from the man that she was sugar dating, and one of her main concerns was what to do with that money, because it's this large sum of money for a lot of people. That's more than they would make in a year that she's deriving from sugar dating, but it's also money that's obtained through stigmatized means.
Yeah.
So she was like, I literally have this cash under my mattress, which feels
I could
retro.
I could help her spend it. There are a few bags I've got my eye on. I could help her out.
Shove that under my pillow. Yeah, no, when I talked to her, I was like, that's like basically my grad student stipend.
Yeah, I feel like she's in the wrong trade. If you have this cash and you don't know what to do with it and it's just sitting under your bed, like, you're in the wrong business.
Yeah, you know, call us over. We'll have a little dinner. We can share.
Yeah. Interesting.
So she talked about money, and then, you know, I had a couple other conversations with people who thought of sugar dating as a way to, and you know, this gets to that point about entrepreneurialism as well, not just obtain economic capital, but also social and cultural capital. So when you are pursuing, let's say you are a woman and you're interested in starting a company, but you need access to potential investors, seed capital, etc. Sugar dating is this potential avenue to get in the room with folks who have those connections.
Does that play out ever? Like, because there's the Julia Roberts Pretty Woman that I think is imprinted on our cultural imagination. Do you ever see that happening? Because I want to talk to the data we kind of have on hypergamy, which it suggests that endogamy is the thing that happens most. Like, people would marry within their class. Like, if you have a PhD, you're likely to marry someone with a PhD. If you make a certain amount, the man is supposed to have a certain amount. And if anything, women are finding it hard to date and marry up because men are getting less college degrees. So it's actually women marrying down and the men practicing hypergamy. So I'm curious about that. Like, does this work as a golden ticket? Is this going to mean that, like, you're going to get your company funded by some fancy VC guy?
That I don't know. I wish I had some good numbers on it. But what I do know, because so much of my research has focused on the relationship between sugar dating and the digital intimacy economy. So basically what we know is that the internet has made it possible for people to meet others with whom they may not have interacted with before. So you described earlier, you know, one example of someone going to a bar and maybe cozying up to a guy and kind of slowly getting into the conversation of forming some type of mutually beneficial relationship. The internet gave us the opportunity to do that through apps and websites.
I met my husband on Twitter. I wasn't sugaring. I just used
Twitter.
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying the idea that you can meet men on the internet that you wouldn't come across in real life. Like, maybe we would cross paths, but it's just like the internet has done this kind of thing of like almost democratizing connections a bit more. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So barriers that were present before, you know, you may not have been able to get access to the country club where you would find the guys who are potentially whales. But now you could make a seeking account. You could even try to do it on a vanilla app.
You could slide in the DMs.
Oh, yeah. Slide in the DMs, sprinkle in some language about allowances and generosity and those sorts of things and just see what happens. So you can do that where it may have been more challenging to do before. But what I have learned from my research is that legislation like FOSTA SESTA, app store regulations, you know, this question of which types of apps are or aren't allowed in Google Play or in Apple's App Store, dictate the ways that we're able to find intimacy online. And what I do know is that it is getting harder and harder to find those opportunities online. And I think that that is something that has really emerged as a key tension for people who want to sugar date, is where you are or aren't able to do that. And, you know, what are the potential safety implications of trying to do it in the spaces where you can still get away with it.
It's so interesting to me because I know the Trump administration has been a crucial part of like some of the legislation that restricts this type of activity online. But I think there's something inherently conservative about sugar dating. Like, it's very classic in the sense it's like woman has potentially less social and economic power. Man has more power. Woman seeks man. They have a very crude exchange, which is like Taylor's oldest time. And I don't know, this is my speculation and you can tell me if I'm wrong. I think there's something about our current political and social climate that has made women more inclined towards this type of thing, not just because, you know, the neoliberal project has failed and the economy is harder.
Yeah.
So it's just like, I do need to supplement my income by dating some man. But also there is like, as we talk about that spectrum between sugar dating and perhaps marrying up and perhaps like ending up as a trad wife eventually, those things being more appealing and being something a woman is willing to do feels like of this moment. Whereas like when I was watching Sex and the City, when I was a teenager, the women were like, you know, we make our own money, even though Big had a lot of money, let's be honest. But you know what I mean? That was the idea was like, we're doing this for love and for sex and for companionship. We don't need these men for their money. So it just feels like the climate is shaping women's willingness to do these things. And I find it ironic that it's like a conservative administration making the legislation to be like, you shouldn't do this, you know?
And I think it's really because, like I said, there is that decentering of marriage. You know, the conservative ideological project of the romantic relationship is to have a man and a woman meet and fall in romantic love and get married. And then she has babies and stays at home and he is that traditional breadwinner. Sugar dating, you know, again, with the caveat that there might be people who enter it and move into one of those relational models, still operates with this broader mutual benefit framework.
It's destabilizing.
Wherein, exactly. It's not, so a woman, she might enter and get money, get gifts, other sorts of things, but then walk away from that and take those resouroses elsewhere. She is not, you know, committing to that project of marriage and of reproduction and of, you know, heterosexual domesticity. And I think with that in mind, the friction right now with the administration makes a ton of sense.
That's so helpful because I forgot about the fact that like the crude exchange is one that for most they don't want to end up in marriage, and then it's like inherently sex positive, right? Because it's this woman saying deciding what she does with her body in a way that conservatism, and I actually think a lot of liberal circles, like I feel like my progressive friends frown on sugaring a lot more than I think like my conservative friends do. Yeah, because I think my conservative friends think human beings are debased anyway. So they're like, of course women are doing this. Whereas my progressive friends like have like, especially the women have this kind of attached this higher moral value to what they do with their body and their time. And they think that is taking women backwards. Whereas I think conservatives, unfortunately, sometimes have a very reduced view of women anyway. So that's I think the tension there. I'm interested because we've talked a lot about heterosexual arrangements and sugar dating. But I'm curious about queer communities. Do we see this among lesbians, among trans folk, among like gay communities? Like how does sugar dating look outside of like the heteronormative sphere? Because I don't think this is just a thing straight people do. Yeah,
there absolutely are queer sugar relationships. And this is a direction I'm hopeful my research will go in, because a lot of the, you know, project of my dissertation was really trying to sink into this popular imaginary, which again is like super hetero, super reliant on, you know, men being one particular thing, women being one particular thing, and they find each other and form relationships. So I would love to see more work done to explore how men are using Grindr to form sugar relationships. Because I've had, you know, anecdotally, I've had conversations with a couple friends who are familiar with that.
Yeah, because when I think of
women.
Sorry, I was going to say, when I think of hypergamy, I think of like David Furnish and Elton John. Do you know what I mean? I just think, you know, that's like the first image that comes to mind, an age gap relationship, somebody who's globally famous with like millions and millions of pounds and a partner who doesn't have as much money. It's interesting how it, you know, the cultural trope is young blonde woman with like older kind of unattractive man with money. But I think there are other versions of that exist around us, but we don't necessarily see them as sugar dating or hypergamy. Not to say David and Elton are it was a sugaring relationship, but just to say that like in terms of the category, there's lots of other people that can perhaps fit into it and be close to it.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem is the way that that early wave of sugar dating websites packaged sugar dating for us and sold it to us as a practice. So we can look at Seeking as the canonical example of that, because they emerged in 2006, became the most popular sugar dating website. Still, you know, at least based on my conversations and my reading, exists to this day as the site that people name drop most often when they're sugar dating,
Oh,
despite the fact that they've gone through this whole rebrand and they've completely disowned sugar dating.
Yeah.
And now they're a website for like success-minded people who want their soulmate. That's a whole other conversation. But basically, the way that, you know, their business logic seemed to function was that they wanted to have these really legible, imagined users. And that became a man who identifies as a sugar daddy who is interested in women, and then a woman who identifies as a sugar baby who's interested in finding men. So these websites package those two different roles, and literally as roles. You know, it used to be when you would go on Seeking, you would sign up for one of those two, either as like a generous website member or an attractive website member, which is, you know, a whole can of worms. Again, we can unpack that further. But the way that they sold us sugar dating was as a heterosexual relational experience. So that then, you know, became perpetuated through other media examples that I explored in my research, other websites and apps that emerged, you know, the ways people were talking about sugar dating, that just became the really recognizable version of sugaring, which then really sucks for people who don't fit that mold, because you feel less visible on these websites or in online communities. You know, when you have people telling you that the way that you sugar date is as someone who either identifies as heterosexual or is interested in forming a heterosexual relationship, I would imagine that it is, you know, kind of alienating to be someone who doesn't fit that mold, but who is still interested in the practice. So I would love to, either myself or hopefully others who are also doing research about sugar dating, continue to explore how queer people are experiencing sugar relationships, trying to find sugar relationships online, and grappling with the, you know, the distance between how they experience the practice.
I know that your work kind of focused on, you know, the women who are sugaring, but I've always been deeply curious about, you know, the daddy part of the equation, like the person with the sugar.
I did talk to some daddies.
Yeah, you did talk to some daddies. And I want to get your perspective on like what drove them and their psyches. And I find it so interesting because, you know, there's legislation like the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, which Trump signed in his first term. I always find it interesting that they always want to legislate against the sugar baby rather than the sugar daddy. Like the criminalization always seems to fall, or the regulation on the woman who is trying to get this economic good, rather than the man who's kind of giving it away, in the way that like we demonize prostitutes but not the John.
I agree with you about the frustration with how these legislations function and who gets penalized. And my sense is that a lot of it has to do with who is perceived as the worker and who is perceived as the client. And then the worker is the one who is, you know, participating in that labor that has been stigmatized and then becomes penalized. And because a lot of women fall onto that side of things, my sense is that that's why we end up with that, you know, imbalance in how people are penalized for this. And then as far as the men that I spoke to, you know, there were a few who were sugar dating because they wanted extramarital affairs. And there was someone else I spoke to. I mentioned earlier that I had a few conversations with men about money. There was someone who told me he makes like 9 figures or something. Just, you know, it sounded like he fit that definition of the whale.
He was a whale.
A lot of people are chasing. He was a whale. Yeah, he was a whale. And he was having a hard time vanilla dating because he either felt like he couldn't talk about money because he was afraid of being judged, or, you know, people being in it for the wrong reasons, etc. Or again, if he did talk about it, he had to, you know, constantly worry that someone was only with him because he was a whale. So he felt like, at least in sugar dating, cards were on the table. He's there because he has that money. Women might be there for him because they're interested in the money. So at least it is transparent.
And how do you think that shaped how they treated the women in these cases? Did they have less respect for them? Did they have more respect for them? Did they see it, this is purely transactional, it's going to have no long-term future? I'm really curious about how it actually impacted the relationship itself.
So everyone I spoke to was pretty respectful of the relationships that they had had. These were all men who were seeking heterosexual relationships. So they had all dated women and spoke highly of the women they had had relationships with. And relationships lasted varying lengths, a couple of months, couple of years, etc. So I don't know if I have a good answer, at least from my interviews that I did, how that, financial aspect of it was shaping the way that they were treating women. I have seen, one of the elements of my research was being a lurker on Reddit for a very long time, still kind of am. So there's a subreddit called Sugar Lifestyle Forum, which has several 100,000 followers. And within it, there's a lot of daily conversations about sugar dating experiences, best practices, etc. And one of the things I had noticed there, which spoke to my interest in how people are using websites and apps to try to sugar date, was the license it seemed like some people felt they had to, speak very overtly about preferences in sugar dating. So this came up especially with race. And there's a really good book by April Williams about sexual racism on online dating. And I felt like it really informed the way that I was seeing these conversations pan out.
Tell me more.
Yeah. So some people felt like because they were potentially paying someone to be in a relationship, they had the right to put on a profile that they, wouldn't date Black women or they wouldn't date women of a certain size, etc., because they were putting that money into it and felt like they were kind of buying the right to curate potential partners in this way that was, obviously super offensive and alienating.
I mean, we know sexual racism exists. In your research, did you find that women of different backgrounds were having more challenges? Like, was there like a hierarchy in who gets picked the most? Is it the blonde, thin, white woman over, an ethnic minority? I'm really curious about how sexual racism actually shapes the women who are trying to sugar, the experience of the women trying to sugar.
Yeah, that was the sense that I got from the interviews. And I got the chance to write about that a little bit in this paper, was that the idea of the white, thin, Eurocentric, kind of conventionally attractive girl next door did still emerge for people as this standard by which they felt like they had to model themselves, which wasn't to say that they weren't finding dates and they weren't finding sugar partners if they didn't fit that mold. But because the social dynamics of especially the websites and apps that people were using for sugar dating outside of the vanilla collection, so people who were using Seeking or who were using Sugar Daddy Meet or something like that, those social dynamics kind of pressured women to make themselves highly visible and to share photos, front-facing photos, full body shots, etc. I had several conversations about this, whereas a lot of men were hiding their profiles.
Interesting.
And, felt like it didn't have to be visible because it mattered more that the women they were pursuing kind of met their aesthetic standards. Having this mandate that's kind of forcing people to make themselves highly visible then makes you feel that pressure to, look like a magazine or whatever, or fit that girl next door mold.
I think that's the crazy thing for me about all of this. Like, I don't come to it from a judgmental way. I'm actually deeply curious. I do worry about sugar baby recruitment, or maybe the online world making it seem easier and more glamorous than it actually is, because ultimately it's labor, it's sexual labor, it's beauty labor, and labor is hard. But it's interesting because the men can be anything. They just need to have money. But it seems that the women still have to fit strict norms and have to dodge regulation and being penalized and being stigmatized. But no one judges a man for necessarily paying for the companionship of a woman. But everyone is going to judge this woman for being paid to be a companion of a man. And it seems like there's just this asymmetry that can't be avoided in these arrangements, no matter how fair women try to make them.
And to my point I raised earlier about the ways that dating websites especially have factored into our socialization into sugar dating, and then have been met by this 2010s and 2020s era of regulation. One of the reasons I first encountered Seeking was that in the 2010s, they did this entire Sugar Baby University campaign where they were, very intentionally trying to recruit young, like teenage 20-something women who were in college because they were trying to build up this base of users. Because one of the things that they did at the time was they showed a ratio on their website of women users to men users on the site. And it was, without fail, 4-1. It was always 4 women to 1 man. So this idea of a surplus, and again, like men having the opportunity to be more discerning on these websites. Young women like me at that time were, very deliberately being pulled in because we were, I would imagine, looked to as this potentially lucrative commodity.
Use this bait basically, and I think who profits the most is Seeking arrangements. It's like the capitalism of it all. It's like you go to the university, you recruit these young, smart, beautiful women, use them as bait, suck them into this system. There's 4 to 1 man or 5 to 1 man. The man gets all the choice and the big company gets all the profits. And you get to sell these premium memberships to these largely men. It seems like a lot of the targeting of those premium memberships was at men, and that's why they were using that ratio over and over again. It was like, you want your pick of the lot. You want the opportunity to meet the most premium women. Come here and pay. I'm curious, you did your research in 2024. We're in 2026 now. Thinking about the next few years where we have rising inequality, a shift to the right, women being forced out of the workforce for various reasons. I think hypergamy will only become more appealing, or sugaring will only become more appealing. I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon, but I'm curious about your perspective, and even seeing the shift between when you did your research and the world we're in now. What do you think happens next?
I think that people will continue to do both. Pursue hypergamous relationships and then also pursue sugar dating. But what is happening, I was just looking at Seeking's website this morning because it feels like it changes by the hour sometimes, in light of changes in markets and social trends and regulation, et cetera. So my reading of the tea leaves of what's going to continue to happen is that websites like Seeking, that in the past had overtly appealed to sugar daters, are going to, even if they don't use the term hypergamy specifically, going to continue to kind of cling to that model and say that they banned sugar dating, but they've built up this user base over the years of people who sugar date, and they're still talking about this intersection of intimacy and economic exchange in relationships. And, basically what's going to happen is that they're not going to offer support for people who sugar date, despite still entertaining the possibility of people who sugar date. So then that puts people in potentially dangerous situations.
Yes, dangerous.
If your DMs or if your profiles are being monitored, and if you can't use language like allowance or benefits or, no strings attached, et cetera, then you have this incentive to pull it off platform and, talk to someone over Google Voice or talk to someone through DMs, through a different app, et cetera. And, the more access points you give someone to yourself, the more potential for doxing that you have or other types of like unintended identity disclosure. So I think that people are still going to use the internet to sugar date, but the avenues to doing it safely and to doing it privately, if that's what you're interested in, are going to become harder and harder to come by.
Wow, that's so fascinating. I've learned so much today. For those at home and our audience, where can they find you and follow you and learn more about your work?
Oh gosh, I need a better social footprint, So I'm on LinkedIn. If you look up Megan Sawey on LinkedIn, I'm there. I'm also on Blue Sky, and I am trying to post more. I got to get better at that. So you'll find me there. And
do you know what? We need you to do like the smart work in the academy so we can read all the studies and we bring you on the show and we learn. It's probably good that you're not all over social media. Thank you, Dr. Sawey. You've been great. I really appreciate this.
Thank you so much, Christiana. This has been awesome.